The refinery wakes me before the synthetic dawn of the hive, a low mechanical thrum vibrating through the steel skeleton of the factory, and I descend the narrow grated stairwell into the bowels of the vats, my lungs already tasting the acrid perfume of bleach, formaldehyde, and burned flesh, as if the air itself were a punishment designed to keep me awake and aware of every second I have surrendered to this place. The vats themselves are immense, their blackened surfaces writhing with shadows, churning with the pale slurry of those who once breathed and now are only names in the logbooks, numbers etched into the memory of the mechanicus and the whispers of the refinery. And I begin my work, my hands gripping the rotating levers, wrists aching, knuckles raw, stirring in the prescribed arcs that the foremen dictate, and all the while the hum of machinery beats a rhythm into my skull, as though the factory itself is alive, a god of steel and chemical fire, and I am its humble acolyte, my mind eroding. With the repetition, my thoughts dissolving into the pulse of the vats, but the memories refuse to stay buried. I see the faces of those lost to the starch, their outlines pressed into my vision like half-formed hallucinations, eyes that plead and accuse me for what I do not understand I have done, for what I have survived while they did not, and sometimes the steam rising from the vats carries faint whispers, syllables of old imperial prayers, or the laughter of a child who died long before their time, and I can never be sure which. And this ambiguity gnaws at me as I stir, the steel mixing arms groaning under the weight of the slurry, chains rattling in rhythm with my heartbeat, and the floor beneath me thrums with vibrations that seem almost alive, as though the factory itself remembers every life it has consumed and is cataloguing me now, a silent witness, a potential next victim of its devouring embrace. I wonder sometimes if the foremen see it too, if the priests of the Mechanicus sense the faint echo of souls clinging to the vats, or if they are too far gone, already fused with the machinery in ways my flesh will never endure. And I think of the upper levels of the hive, the rare glimpses of light seen only by those with clearance, and I ache for the warmth of sun on my face, a sensation I cannot remember, and yet, even that longing is twisted, for my body has adapted to the stench and the chill, to the constant presence of death. And I am no longer sure if I would survive outside the refinery, the air too clean, the silence too loud, my senses screaming at the absence of machine song. As I stir, my arms cramping, my back burning, I recite liturgies in my head, prayers to the machine god that I have never learned, improvising syllables that sound like devotion but taste like desperation, and the slurry sloshes around the edges of the vat, bubbling and frothing, a pale imitation of life. And I swear that sometimes I can see figures moving within it, glimpses of arms and torsos, that vanish the moment I blink, and I know it is not imagination, for I feel the presence pressing against me, urging, judging, and in the rare moments I lower my gaze from the mixers, I see the shadows of my co-workers reflected in the steel walls, gaunt faces, hollow eyes, and I know we are all slowly hollowing each other out, not through malice, but through the inevitability of this work, and the factory is patient, methodical, an endless tutor of suffering, teaching me, teaching all of us, that our value is measured only in precision, obedience, and the ability to ignore the pleading of the dead, that compassion is a weakness, and madness is the only true companion. Yet even as I push through the cycles, I think of the whispers, the faces, the shapes, under the surface of the vats, and I shiver despite the heat, a tremor of recognition that the refinery is not merely a factory, it is a crucible, forging more than starch, more than obedience. It is molding us into something unrecognizable, the line between human and machine blurring with each passing hour, and I feel my own mind fraying at the edges, fragments of memory slipping into the mixture, and I am afraid to look down, afraid to see that my own face, my own essence has already begun to dissolve into the white churn, and I wonder if survival is worth the cost of losing all I was, all I could have been, and still I stir. Because to stop would be to summon immediate and brutal reprisal, to invite the cold judgment of the Mechanicus, whose eyes are everywhere, whose ears are in the piping and the vents, whose devotion to calculation leaves no room for mercy. I have begun to dream of the vats themselves, nightmares where the slurry rises and engulfs me, memories I cannot distinguish from reality, waking and seeing my hands coated in the pale substance as though the dream never ended, and sometimes I hear laughter faint, mocking, metallic, perhaps the machines themselves, and I understand that in the Imperium, there is no comfort, only survival, and that survival requires me to surrender everything, body, mind, and spirit, and yet, in these fleeting hours, I also feel the faintest spark of something else, a stubborn whisper of self that refuses to yield completely, a mental flicker that whispers that I am still here, still human, still observing, still aware, and that spark is fragile, easily snuffed out by the hum and hiss of the refinery, by the steam and chemical fire, by the relentless turning of vats filled with those who came before. But it exists, and I clutch it, cherishing it as I stir, aware that each motion could be the last vestige of my sanity, aware that in vast, uncaring darkness of the hive, I am a single flickering flame against the mechanized void, a flame that might yet be snuffed, but refuses to die. And so I continue, stirring, listening, watching, feeling, dreaming, and surviving in the horrifying, endless life of a Corpse-Starch Vat-Stirrer in the grim darkness of the Warhammer 40,000 universe, where there is only work, only duty, only the slow erasure of the self against the eternal machinery of the Imperium of Man. The cycle continues, relentless, and I feel the refinery settle into my bones like a second skeleton, the steel underfoot vibrating with the memories of countless shifts, and as I descend once more into the vat's bowels, the hum of machinery greets me like a familiar curse, a lullaby of industry and death that wraps around my consciousness and refuses to let go, my breath heavy, tasting of chemical fire and the faint copper temps of dried blood that seeps from unknown sources in the depths. And though my body moves with the rhythm I have learned since I first arrived, my mind wanders unbidden, tracing the faint outlines of shadows in the vat's mist, the suggestion of forms moving just beneath the surface, whispering in languages that twist in my ears like smoke. Words I cannot translate yet feel as clear as any sermon from the Mechanicus. And I am suddenly aware that the refinery is watching, not merely observing my actions but measuring my essence, cataloging every twitch of muscle, every flicker of thought, a meticulous record of obedience or weakness, and I shudder at the thought that the vats remember me as much as I remember them, that the machinery holds not only starch but a lingering memory of every soul ever consumed. And I am afraid of what will happen when the memory of me is added to the chorus of ghosts trapped in the churn. Yet I cannot stop, my hands gripping the levers, wrists raw, elbows screaming, repeating the arc of motion drilled into me as though the pattern itself might stave off the madness, creeping along the edges of my mind. And sometimes I pause, though I know I must not, to listen to the hiss of the steam, the rattle of chains, the distant clanging of metal against metal, and I imagine the entire refinery as a single organism, lungs and arteries of steel and machinery pumping a toxic lifeblood through the hive, and I feel simultaneously insignificant and essential, a cog that cannot be removed without consequence, yet a mind that can fracture under the weight of what it witnesses, and the slurry in the vats catches the faintest light, rising and falling like waves on a blackened sea, reflecting ghostly shapes that my mind cannot name, and I swear I feel their gaze upon me, accusing, questioning, waiting, and I feel a pulse of fear that is almost physical, radiating through my chest and limbs, a trembling echo of the realization that I am alone, yet never alone. For the refinery itself is a companion that judges and punishes with equal rigor, and my thoughts spiral into memories that are not mine, fragments of conversations, laughter, screams, perhaps dreams of those already consumed, slipping between synapses like toxic fire, and I try to shake them, to remind myself that I am still living, still breathing, still stirring. But the line between my own identity and the slurry in the vats is thinning, almost imperceptibly, and I feel a nausea that has nothing to do with the air but with the growing certainty that I am already part of the process. My essence absorbed into the rhythm, my soul measured against the beat of machinery and found wanting, and yet, I continue, because the alternative is immediate reprisal, and fear keeps me moving even when my body screams for respite, even when my mind begs for a pause I cannot grant. And as the hours stretch, I notice details that I have never seen before, the glint of something metallic caught in the slurry, a fleeting reflection that resembles a face, or the faint odor of ozone, sharp and biting, carried from the deeper levels of the hive, suggesting some machinery older than memory, some part of the Imperium's industrial heart that even the Mechanicus no longer dares to touch, and I feel the pull of curiosity and dread intertwined, knowing that every step closer to knowledge could be the last I ever take, yet unable to resist the instinct to observe, to register, to catalogue, to assert my existence against the consuming void, and in this fragile assertion, I recognize a truth I have long avoided. The refinery is not merely a workplace, it is a test, a crucible, an oracle, and survival demands more than diligence. It demands a surrender, a letting go of self, and the acceptance that one may emerge human in body only, not in spirit, and I wonder if that is what the foreman, the Mechanicus, and perhaps even the Emperor himself desire, and I shiver at the thought, feeling the cold fingers of realization crawling up my spine as I stir, the slurry thickening around the edges of the vat, bubbling like a living thing, and I imagine the faces beneath the surface moving, whispering encouragement, warning, mockery, and I am haunted by the duality of their presence, simultaneously terrifying and comforting, a reminder of what awaits all who falter, and yet, strangely, a companion in my endless labor. And as I repeat the motions, my hands blistering, my forearms trembling, I hear a subtle change in the machinery, a faint creak, a hesitation in the rhythm, and I know instinctively that I am not alone in more ways than I first realized, that something has awakened, whether a construct, a spirit, or some unknown force of the hive, I cannot say, but its attention is on me, focused, patient, and I feel the weight of eyes that are not human but see with understanding. And my stomach twists with a combination of fear, awe, and a grim recognition that I am being tested in ways I cannot fully comprehend. And the slurry rises with unnatural viscosity, clinging to the edges of the vat, reflecting my own haggard face back at me, and I see not just fatigue but the subtle erosion of my mind, the narrowing of thought into routine, the numbing of emotion into survival. And I feel a pang of mourning for the self I once was, even as I clutch at the fragile spark that remains, a last remnant of human will against the cold, unfeeling tide of the hive, and I whisper a prayer I do not understand, a muttered litany to the machine god, the emperor, or perhaps only to the fragments of my own identity, and I feel the machinery hum, a response or perhaps merely coincidence, but it feels alive, sentient, aware of my trembling persistence, and I realize with a jolt that the vats themselves are conscious in ways I cannot measure, that the refinery remembers, and that my existence is but one cycle in an unending loop of observation, consumption, and ritual, and I tremble with awe and terror in equal measure, and I continue to stir, slow, methodical, deliberate, each rotation a defiance of the void, a testament to the stubborn flame of human will that refuses to be fully extinguished even within the suffocating embrace of the Imperium's industrial maw, knowing that each stir brings me closer to knowledge, to endurance, to survival, yet also closer to the point where self and slurry, observer and observed, reality and nightmare may merge irreversibly in the horrifying infinity of the refinery's heart. The refinery's pulse has become inseparable from my own heartbeat, a low, droning rhythm that echoes through steel and bone alike, and I descend again into the bowels of the vats. Each step a careful negotiation with rusted grates that groan under my weight, while the air thickens with chemical fog and the acrid temps of industrial decay, a perfume I have learned to breathe without thought, though it clings to my lungs and throat like a living thing, and I am aware with every inhalation that the slurry below waits as if alive, a churning mirror reflecting my own fatigue and hollowed expression, and the edges of my vision betray flickers of movement that cannot belong to machinery, alone half-formed silhouettes beneath the mist, glimpses of faces that might be human, might be memory, might be something older, something the Mechanicus has long denied, and I feel a subtle tightening in my chest as recognition flares. The uncanny sense that I am not merely stirring a vat but conversing silently with the echoes of the dead, their presence both accusation and reassurance, their whispers threading through my mind, pulling at recollections I no longer trust, memories that might belong to me, or to those claimed by the starch, or perhaps to the factory itself, whose consciousness, subtle and patient, has begun to weave itself into the fabric of my perception, and I shiver involuntarily, feeling the fine line between self and environment dissolve, knowing that my survival depends on maintaining motion, on repeating the endless arcs drilled into my arms, on listening to the rhythm of the vats and matching it, matching the hiss of steam, the groan of gears, the occasional scream of vented pressure, which can be either mechanical failure or a human voice trapped somewhere in the refinery's depths. And the ambiguity gnaws at me like acid, for in the hive there is no comfort in certainty, only the relentless test of endurance, and as I stir, I begin to feel the slurry's viscosity increase, clinging more aggressively to my gloves and arms, almost as if it seeks purchase, awareness, an intimacy that unsettles my bones, and I cannot help but glance downward, my reflection fractured in the pale, shifting liquid, seeing not just my weariness but a subtle distortion of form, a hint that the boundary between flesh and machine, observer and observed, is thinning under the weight of countless cycles, and my mind recoils even as it is drawn forward, compelled by curiosity, terror, and a grim sense of duty. And I recall the warnings of foremen whose voices were brief, clipped, devoid of warmth, insisting that precision and vigilance are salvation, that any hesitation could summon the wrath of the Mechanicus or the unseen forces that dwell in the refinery's arteries, and I feel the weight of that command pressing on my shoulders, coiling into a tension that hums in my muscles and sinews. A living reminder that the hive does not forgive, and neither does the refinery. And yet, even in this suffocating environment, I noticed details I had never registered before. A subtle sheen on the vat's surface, a faint glow from fissures in the steel, the soft echo of my own voice in the cavernous hallways as I mutter prayers I barely understand. Syllables improvised to appease the god of machinery, or perhaps the fragments of my own sanity. And the reflection catches something, a fleeting shadow that does not belong to me, that shifts independently, and my throat tightens with a mix of fear and fascination, for it is watching, patient, assessing, and I feel an almost electrical charge crawl along my spine, the hairs rising on my arms, the fine tremor that is the body's acknowledgement of something beyond comprehension. And I am suddenly aware that I am neither alone nor fully alive in the ordinary sense, that I am entwined with the refinery, with the vats, with the starch, with every cycle of repetition, every inhalation of mist and chemical residue, and the realization gnaws at the edges of my consciousness. I am becoming one with this place, whether I will it or not, my identity slowly conforming to the rhythm and memory of the industrial heart of the hive, and I wonder, almost morbidly, whether there will be a point at which I will stir, not because I am compelled by fear or duty, but because the machinery itself dictates my motions, shaping me as it shapes the slurry, eroding individuality until I am only a conduit for the refinery's endless song. And the thought is both horrifying and inevitable, a duality that mirrors the flickering forms I now see beneath the surface. Shadows that press against the boundary of liquid and air, hinting at faces, limbs, perhaps whispers, and I am unable to look away, drawn to their silent, accusatory observation, feeling guilt and recognition intertwine with fear and fascination. And in that moment I realize that this chapter of my life is not merely labor or survival, but a communion, a pact with the industrial spirit of the hive, whether I acknowledge it or resist it. And I feel the subtle shift in air pressure, the soft hiss of a vent opening, a distant metallic clang, and it strikes me with a shocking clarity that every sound, every vibration, every flicker of reflection carries meaning, and that to ignore these signs is to court disaster. And so I listen acutely, interpreting the machinery as language, the vats as scripture, the mist as metaphor, and my hands continue their labor, blistered and trembling, but guided by a rhythm that is no longer entirely mine, a symphony of mechanical, chemical, and psychic resonance that envelops me. And yet, even as I am drawn into this communion, a fragment of my former self resists, whispering that I am still human, still sentient, still capable of thought and choice, and I cling to that fragile spark, precious and fleeting, as I navigate the labyrinthine cycles, the swirling slurry, the flickering shadows, the whispers and vents, and the ghostly reflections. And I understand, with both dread and awe, that the refinery does not simply consume the dead, it catalogs, it assimilates, it shapes the living, and in every stir of the vat, in every echo of machinery, in every twitch of shadow beneath the mist, I am confronted with the horrifying realization that I am both survivor and sacrifice, observer and participant, flesh and witness. And as I continue my endless, precise motions, feeling the slurry's grip, the machinery's pulse, the weight of unseen eyes, the soft tendrils of memory and hallucination threading through my mind, I understand that this is the essence of my existence here. Perpetual labor, perpetual observation, perpetual communion with the dead and the machine, and in that understanding lies both terror and a strange, perverse solace. For to recognize the inevitability is to endure it, and I stir on, driven by rhythm, fear, memory, and the fragile, stubborn spark of self that refuses to vanish entirely. Even in the horrifying, suffocating heart of the hive, the hours stretch into something timeless as I descend yet again into the depths of the vats, the refinery's mechanical heartbeat syncing with my own until it is impossible to tell where I end and the factory begins, and the air grows heavier, saturated with the sour tang of chemicals and the faint, unsettling scent of something organic, something lingering that the foreman would call a hazard, but I know is more than mere odor. It is the residue of memory, of life devoured and catalogued, faint traces of what once was, and the vats themselves seem to ripple in recognition of my presence, the white slurry undulating as though aware, reflecting not just light but fragments of my thoughts, fears, and fleeting dreams. And I am forced to wonder if this is the machine's doing or merely my mind betraying me, as hallucinations and reality blur. in the soft glow of warning lights, and I see shapes beneath the surface, half-formed, indistinct arms reaching, faces twisting, a chorus of the lost echoing in silence, speaking in syllables that my rational mind cannot translate. Yet their meaning seeps into my consciousness like poison in the bloodstream, and I feel the tug of memory that is not entirely mine. Glimpses of lives erased, fragments of laughter, screams, whispered, prayers, and I clutch at the rhythm of the stirring, my knuckles raw, wrists aching, trying to anchor myself to the pattern, to the physical act that has become my lifeline, or without it I might dissolve entirely into the refinery's embrace, become another ghost in the starch, another whisper in the pipes. And I realize with a jolt that I am being watched, not just by those lost to the vats, but by something older, something patient, something that measures my compliance and my fear, and I feel a tightening in my chest as the thought grows, the undeniable sense that the refinery itself, every pipe, lever, and vat, is alive, sentient in a way designed to test and break us in equal measure, and I shiver despite the heat and the labor, muscles trembling, sweat burning my eyes. For I am acutely aware that to falter, even momentarily, is to invite disaster, whether from the mechanicus, the foreman, or the unseen consciousness that governs this place. And I wonder if the refinery hungers not just for obedience, but for the essence of those who work it, consuming fragments of memory, will, and identity, until only the husk remains, a vessel for the eternal rhythm. And the thought terrifies me, yet fascinates me, and I find myself glancing repeatedly into the vat's surface, seeing not only shadows but reflections of myself altered, twisted subtly, as if the machine is showing me what I am becoming, a blend of human and mechanism, flesh and routine, mind and memory interwoven with the unending churn of starch, and I feel the spark of resistance, faint but persistent, struggling against the encroaching erosion of self, reminding me that though the vats demand motion, observation, and surrender, I still possess thought, fear, and perhaps some fragment of choice, though choice is an illusion in the hive, and I understand this fully as I navigate the labyrinthine corridors, the steam-filled chambers, the echoing clangs and hisses, every sound a warning, every vibration a signal, and yet I continue, compelled by a mixture of instinct, dread, and stubborn persistence, because to stop is unthinkable, and because in the relentless repetition, in the communion with the machinery and the dead, I glimpse a strange, perverse comfort. The refinery is predictable, calculable, eternal, unlike the fragile, chaotic impulses of the human mind, and in this recognition lies both terror and solace, for I am both prisoner and participant, observer and consumed, alive and partially surrendered, and as I stir, I feel the slurry's viscosity increase, clinging to my gloves, my arms, my body, as though it seeks to merge with me, to claim me gradually, and I cannot distinguish whether it is machine or memory, hallucination or reality, and this uncertainty gnaws at me relentlessly, each stir a reminder of my vulnerability, each rotation a meditation on endurance and identity, and in the rare moments when I pause, ever so briefly, to wipe sweat from my brow or adjust my posture, I see movement that is not mine, a fleeting shadow in the steam, the glint of metal in the mist, reflections that do not match my own, and I am filled with awe, terror, and a deep gnawing curiosity, for I know instinctively that I am being measured, tested, catalogued, not just for precision but for essence, and I feel the weight of countless eyes, mechanical, organic, spectral, upon me, and I shiver, a tremor of recognition that I am no longer simply human, not entirely, but part of the refinery's eternal rhythm, and the thought both frightens and consoles me, for if I am part of the machinery, I am essential, and if essential, perhaps I endure, though at the cost of all that I once was or might have been, and yet, even as this realization settles, I sense subtle changes, shifts in air pressure, faint vibrations beneath my feet, the soft hiss of vents opening, distant clangs, the whisper of chains, and I know with a certainty that chills me that these are not random, but deliberate signals from a consciousness older and vaster than any human mind, and I feel the weight of awareness pressing in, my mind straining to process, to observe, to survive, to retain the fragile spark of self amidst the suffocating omnipresence of the vats, the slurry, and the factory itself, and I stir, on blistered hands, trembling arms aching, eyes flickering between shadow, reflection, and light, acutely aware of the inevitable erosion of identity, the slow encroachment of the refinery into my thoughts, my memories, my fears, and yet, I continue, because the cycle demands it, because survival is inseparable from obedience, because in the endless churn of the Corpse-Starch vats, in the cold, measured gaze of machinery, in the soft almost imperceptible whisper of those consumed, I find a rhythm, a purpose, a fragile affirmation that I endure, that I exist, and that even in the terrifying, suffocating heart of the hive, a spark of humanity persists, flickering against the encroaching dark. The refinery feels alive in ways I can no longer rationalize, its pulse now inseparable from my own, and as I descend once more into the subterranean expanse of vats, the pale slurry below swirls with a viscous, almost sentient rhythm, reflecting not only the harsh red and green, warning lights above, but fragments of memories and faces that do not belong to me yet insist on recognition. And I feel my stomach tighten as the weight of observation presses from every corner, the echoing chains, the hissing steam vents, the groaning steel supports, all seemingly attuned to the cadence of my labor. And I realize with a creeping horror that the refinery is aware not only of my motions but of my thoughts, cataloging the hesitation, the fear, the stubborn flicker of human will that refuses to fully dissolve into the industrial liturgy. And I am forced to question where the machinery ends and the psychic presence of the consumed begins. For in moments of pause I see shadows swim beneath the slurry surface, limbs and faces forming and dissolving in a manner that is impossible yet undeniable, and sometimes I hear whispers in my own voice, syllables that mimic prayers I do not remember learning, echoing back at me from the metal walls as if the factory itself repeats, judges, and mocks my attempts at rationalization. And I am suddenly aware that I am being tested, not merely for precision but for resilience, for the capacity to endure the dissolution of identity without succumbing to despair. And I feel my pulse racing, muscles taut, knuckles blistered from gripping the levers that command the vat's mechanical arms, as the slurry's viscosity thickens, clinging to my gloves and arms like an extension of itself, a subtle pressure that presses against my skin and into my consciousness, reminding me that my body is not separate from the refinery but part of it, a living conduit for the unending rhythm. And I find my mind wandering into corridors of thought I try to suppress, memories that may not even be my own, faces of lost workers surfacing as if the slurry has captured fragments of their essence and returned them in hallucination, and the boundaries of reality bend, a sensation amplified by the intermittent hiss of steam, the occasional clang of distant metal, the flickering industrial lights that cast the shadows in grotesque, exaggerated angles. And I tremble despite my efforts to maintain composure, a shiver crawling down my spine that is both fear and awe, because I understand that this place does not merely process the dead but shapes the living, and each cycle of stirring brings me closer to an unknown transformation, one that may strip away my humanity as surely as it consumes the bodies that feed the vats. Yet there is a perverse fascination in this knowledge, a compulsion to witness the process in its entirety, even as my mind screams for pause, for escape, for a reprieve that the hive will never grant. And I feel my thoughts fracturing further under the weight of the refinery's presence. Flashes of light and shadow forming phantoms that speak in tones that evoke emotion without words, anger, sorrow, longing, and I realize with a tightening in my chest that the refinery has become both confessor and tormentor, revealing and reflecting the innermost layers of my psyche against the backdrop of industrial ritual. And I cannot tell if the slurry itself is changing or if my perception is bending, for faces seem to reach from beneath the surface, spectral, hands pressing against the reflective liquid, and my mind recoils yet cannot look away. And in that tension, I recognize the symbiosis of fear and endurance, understanding that to continue stirring is both survival and surrender, a meditation on fragility and strength. And I am acutely aware that the boundary between myself and the vats is narrowing, each rotation of the levers a small concession, a repetition that simultaneously asserts and erases identity. And I feel a creeping sense of inevitability, as if the refinery has orchestrated this state of being for centuries, shaping each worker in turn until all are indistinguishable from the machinery they command. Yet a spark persists in me, stubborn and defiant, reminding me of self, of will, of the faint ember of human awareness that clings even as hallucination, exhaustion, and dread conspire to consume it. And I feel the touch of unseen eyes, mechanical, spectral, human, measuring, judging, anticipating, a presence so pervasive that it presses on my mind like a physical weight. And I wonder if I am being tested for more than endurance, perhaps for comprehension, for understanding of my place in this vast, uncaring organism of steel, mist, and memory. And I tremble, torn between fascination and terror, as the vats churn relentlessly beneath me, reflecting and refracting the world in ways impossible to define. And I sense the refinery's rhythm deep within my bones, a cadence that dictates motion, thought, and breath. and I feel a perverse satisfaction in yielding to it, acknowledging that resistance is as much madness as surrender, and yet, paradoxically, my spark of awareness persists, a small flame against the encroaching darkness, flickering in the periphery of perception, defiant against the inevitability of assimilation, and I realize that survival here is less about strength and more about recognition, patience, and the ability to endure being observed, catalogued, and partially consumed by forces both tangible and unknowable, and I continue to stir, slow, methodical, precise, my eyes scanning the vats, my mind registering every shadow, every whisper, every flicker of reflection, each breath a communion with the refinery, the starch, and the spectral remnants of those who came before, knowing that I am part observer, part participant, part sacrifice, yet still impossibly wholly aware, and that awareness is both curse and shield as I navigate the endless cycles, the soft hiss of vents, the groan of machinery, the shifting shadows beneath the mist, the ephemeral faces that may be memory or hallucination or something else entirely, and I feel the tension in my chest, the ache in my arms, the trembling of hands and knees, and I know with clarity that this is the essence of my existence, perpetual motion, perpetual observation, perpetual communion with the dead and the machine, and even as fear, awe, and fatigue threaten to overwhelm, I continue, sustained by the fragile, stubborn ember of self, aware that even in the terrifying heart of the hive, even amidst the consuming rhythm of the Corpse-Starch vats, I endure, and that endurance, however partial, is my defiance, my prayer, my testament, and my only salvation. The refinery no longer feels like a place I inhabit. It feels like the marrow of my bones, the rhythm of my heartbeat, the pulse of my thoughts, and as I descend one final time into the bowels of the vats, the air is thick with mist, chemical Thames, and the faint, almost imperceptible odor of something organic that clings to my senses and refuses to let go. And I am struck with the awareness that the refinery has been waiting, patient, deliberate, as if this cycle, this moment, was always inevitable, and I feel the subtle tremor of machinery beneath my feet, a vibration that is neither mechanical nor organic, but both, resonating through my bones and embedding itself in my consciousness, and I realize with a shiver that the vats themselves are aware of me in ways I cannot fully comprehend, that every rotation of the levers, every stir of the pale slurry, every breath I take, is observed, catalogued, measured, and reflected back, twisted, refracted, amplified, until I cannot tell which sensations belong to me and which belong to the refinery, or to those whose lives were consumed to feed these machines. And the shadows beneath the surface writhe more insistently, faces and limbs forming and dissolving with a rhythm that is almost mocking, almost seductive, almost comforting, and I feel the tug of recognition, the uncanny certainty that some fragment of those lost speaks to me directly, and I tremble as I grasp the levers tighter, arms aching, knuckles raw, and I sense a subtle change in the slurry itself, its viscosity and flow subtly, shifting as though responding to my presence, and I realize, with a mixture of dread and awe, that I am no longer simply stirring vats, but participating in a communion, a ritual, a merging of will, flesh, and memory, and my mind reels as the boundary between self and refinery collapses, a thin, dissolving line that offers no refuge, no separation, only the awareness that I am part of something vast, eternal, and indifferent, and yet paradoxically, intimately connected, and I feel my thoughts fracturing, spiraling, some flickers of memory, some hallucinations, some impossible truths threading through, whispering that I am at once observer and observed, living and partially consumed, human and mechanical, and the sensation is dizzying, nauseating, and terrifying, and I pause for the briefest instant, only to see shadows rise beneath the slurry, faces I recognize as both mine and not mine, a chorus of the lost, their eyes accusing, imploring, beckoning, and I realize with a cold clarity that they have never left, that the refinery preserves not only bodies but fragments of essence, memory, and consciousness, and that each stir, each rotation, each breath, feeds the cycle, adds to the catalogue, embeds me deeper into the rhythm, and I am confronted with the ultimate question: have I survived this long only to surrender fully, or to witness, with full awareness, the slow erasure of self into the eternal machinery of the hive? And as I lift my gaze, I see reflections in the steel walls, warped, elongated, flickering, showing versions of myself that are less human, more spectral, merged with machinery and slurry, and a shiver crawls along my spine as I realize that endurance is not merely a matter of muscles and sinew, but of mind and spirit, and that the spark of self I have preserved is now fragile, flickering against the encroaching rhythm. And yet, even as fear threatens to overwhelm me, even as hallucination, memory, and machinery intertwine into a seamless, terrifying tapestry, I continue, because the alternative is unthinkable. Because stopping is to be subsumed entirely, body and mind, into the vats and the refinery, and as I stir, I feel subtle pulses through the slurry, almost tactile, a rhythm that answers mine, responds to mine, a dialogue without words. And I understand, impossibly, that the refinery is alive in a way that surpasses machinery, that it thinks, remembers, and judges, and I am humbled, terrified, and exhilarated all at once. For I am part of something larger than comprehension, and yet I cling to the spark of awareness, for it is the last thread of my identity, the fragile proof that I am still human even as the refinery seeks to consume all that is me, and the vats churn with a slow, deliberate inevitability. Shadows shifting beneath the mist, whispering words I cannot understand, words that feel like prophecy, warning, and confession, and I feel a strange kinship with the lost, a shared endurance, a communion of suffering and persistence, and I recognize that this is the true nature of survival in the Imperium, not triumph, not safety, but recognition, observation, communion, and the stubborn persistence of self against overwhelming, indifferent forces. And as I stir, I feel my mind stretch, warp, yet cling, and I know that the refinery has tested me fully, that it has observed, catalogued, and assimilated fragments of my consciousness into its eternal rhythm, yet has allowed a flicker to remain, a delicate, fragile ember that defies erasure, and I am left with an awareness that is at once horrifying and sublime. The understanding that I am both consumed and persistent, erased and preserved, mortal and yet part of something timeless, and I feel my hands trembling, arms burning, knuckles raw, and I lift my gaze to the vat's surface, seeing reflections that are both my own and not my own, shadows that flicker, dance, and watch, and I whisper a prayer I do not fully understand, a litany of endurance, acknowledgement, and defiance, and the refinery hums in response, a deep, resonant vibration that fills the chamber, vibrating through bone, sinew, and spirit. And I am both terrified and comforted, knowing that even in the heart of this suffocating industrial maw, even amidst the pale churn of the Corpse-Starch vats, I have endured, and that endurance, however partial, however fractured, is itself victory, a testament to the human spark, fragile yet unextinguished. And as I complete the final rotations, feeling every ache, tremor, and pulse, I realize with a mix of exhaustion and awe that survival in the Imperium is not heroic or celebratory, but an ongoing, intimate communion with forces far beyond comprehension, a negotiation with machinery, death, memory, and self. And I stir on, fully aware, fully present, a single ember flickering in the infinite darkness, a Vat-Stirrer enduring, resisting, observing, and persisting in the horrifying, suffocating heart of the Hive.